What if one of the most carefully curated humanitarian images in the world was built on a line that never should have been crossed? Think about that for a second. Because this story doesn't start with a lawsuit. It doesn't start with court filings or legal threats or press statements. It starts with a name, a powerful name, a trusted name, a name that, once attached to something, changes how people see it. And according to growing whispers, that name may have been used in a way that has now triggered a very serious reckoning. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. At the center of it all is Meghan Markle, a woman who understands branding better than almost anyone alive. A former actress turned duchess turned global activist figure, whose public identity has long been intertwined with ideas of compassion, justice, and moral authority. But what happens when those ideas collide with legal reality? What happens when a foundation known for ironclad credibility allegedly decides that enough is enough? And what happens when silence starts speaking louder than press releases? Because right now, the allegation sending shockwaves through celebrity philanthropy circles is this: that the Clooney Foundation for Justice has taken legal action against the Archewell Foundation over what it believes were misleading partnership claims. Let that sink in. Not a social media spat, not anonymous criticism, not tabloid gossip. A foundation built by one of the most respected humanitarian legal minds in the world allegedly saying, in effect, you cannot say that. So the question becomes unavoidable. Was this a misunderstanding? A branding error? A careless phrase buried in a press release? Or was this something far more consequential? Something that crossed a line in a world where trust is the only real currency? Short sentences matter here, because every word matters. In the modern charity ecosystem, perception isn't just everything. It is the product. Donations don't flow because of paperwork. They flow because people believe in the story being told. They believe in the associations being implied. They believe that the names they see standing side by side actually belong there. And that's why this story matters now. Not last year. Not hypothetically. Now. Because we are living in a moment when celebrity activism is being questioned in ways it never has before. Donors are more skeptical. Journalists are more aggressive. Audiences are more cynical. And foundations with decades of credibility are no longer willing to look the other way when their reputations are even indirectly placed at risk. Ask yourself this: if you ran a global human rights foundation that regularly prosecutes war criminals, defends journalists, and operates in some of the most legally sensitive environments on Earth, how carefully would you guard your name? Would you allow even the suggestion of partnership if it wasn't real? Would you shrug off language that implied alignment you never formally agreed to? Or would you act? Because according to people familiar with how these foundations operate, legal action isn't a first step. It's the last one. Before that come emails, clarifications, quiet requests, polite but firm corrections. Which raises an uncomfortable possibility. What if those steps already happened? What if warnings were issued behind closed doors? What if someone said, very clearly, you need to change this? And what if that didn't happen? This is where the story begins to tighten. Because on the surface, Archewell has always presented itself as collaborative, values-driven, and aligned with global justice initiatives. Its language is aspirational. Its tone is lofty. Its messaging is designed to place it alongside institutions that have spent decades building moral authority. But law doesn't run on vibes. It runs on definitions. In legal terms, the difference between supporting similar causes and partnering with is enormous. One is philosophical. The other is contractual. One is allowed. The other can trigger lawsuits. And in the nonprofit world, misleading implication can be just as damaging as outright falsehood. Here's the contradiction at the heart of this entire controversy. Charity branding thrives on association. Charity law punishes misrepresentation. The tighter the brand narrative, the thinner the margin for error. So when reports began circulating that the Clooney Foundation believed its name had been used in a way that implied a formal relationship, one that did not actually exist, the stakes instantly changed. This wasn't about optics anymore. This was about credibility. Because if the Clooney Foundation allows even one organization to imply partnership without authorization, it sets a precedent. And in law, precedent is everything. Ask yourself something. Why would a foundation tied to some of the world's most serious legal battles risk being associated with anything ambiguous? Why would it tolerate even a hint of brand confusion? It wouldn't, which is why what followed, according to insiders, was not loud outrage, but cold precision. No dramatic interviews, no viral statements, no public finger-pointing, just lawyers. And silence. And silence, in cases like this, is never accidental. Meanwhile, on the other side, the quiet was just as noticeable. No immediate denial, no detailed clarification, no proactive explanation, just nothing. And when both sides go quiet at the same time, you have to ask why. Because if this were truly nothing, wouldn't someone want to shut it down immediately? Wouldn't you rush to reassure donors? Wouldn't you correct the record loudly and clearly? Unless, of course, the record itself was the problem. This is where emotional beats start to hit. Because for supporters who believed Archewell represented a new, transparent model of philanthropy, the idea of misleading claims cuts deep. And for critics who have long argued that celebrity foundations blur lines too easily, this feels like validation. Two audiences, two completely different reactions, one growing storm. And yet, we still don't have the full picture. We don't know which specific language triggered the response. We don't know how long the issue simmered. We don't know how many attempts were made to resolve it quietly. What we do know is this: charities do not sue unless they believe their integrity is under threat. They do not invite scrutiny unless they are confident in their position. And they do not escalate unless they believe the other side will not, or cannot, fix the issue on its own. Which brings us back to Meghan Markle, a figure whose public journey has been defined by narrative control, by telling her story before others can, by reframing controversy as empowerment. But law doesn't care about narrative arcs. It cares about evidence. And if this case proceeds, evidence is exactly what will matter. Documents, emails, timelines, language choices, every word weighed, every implication examined. And here's the part that should make everyone pay attention. This isn't just about one foundation and one claim. It's about a larger shift. A moment when elite humanitarian institutions are drawing a hard line between inspiration and implication, between alignment and endorsement, between saying, "We believe in similar things," and saying, "We work together." And if that line has been crossed here, even unintentionally, the consequences could ripple far beyond Archewell. Because once one foundation pushes back, others start paying attention. Others start auditing their own mentions. Others start asking uncomfortable questions. Which means this story isn't shrinking. It's expanding. And the next phase won't be about press narratives or public sympathy. It will be about what's provable, what's documented, and what can no longer be quietly edited away. Because somewhere, buried in language that once sounded harmless, there may be a phrase that changed everything. And once lawyers found it, there was no unseeing it. But what exactly was that phrase? And why did it allegedly trigger such a decisive response? Because what came next didn't happen in public. It happened behind closed doors. And according to those watching closely, that's where the real story begins. What was that phrase? The one buried in plain sight. The one that looked harmless to casual readers. The one that, according to people watching this closely, set off alarms inside one of the most legally disciplined humanitarian organizations on the planet. Because once lawyers notice language, they don't read it the way the public does. They read it like a contract waiting to be misused. And that's where the power of a name comes in. Let me ask you something. If you saw a charity website or press release that appeared to place two foundations side by side, would you assume they work together? Would you assume shared projects? Shared goals? Shared accountability? Of course you would. That assumption is the entire point of name association. And that's exactly why the next part of this story matters more than people realize. Because the name in question wasn't just any name. It was the Clooney name. The kind of name that carries legal weight, institutional memory, and global credibility. A name that doesn't just open doors, but defines the room itself. Behind the scenes of the Clooney Foundation for Justice, this is not a feel-good brand. It is a legal operation. A serious one. A foundation that works with courts, prosecutors, governments, and international bodies. Which brings us to the heart of this chapter. The power of a name is not emotional. It's structural, and no one understands that better than the people who built this foundation. At its center is George Clooney, whose public persona may be Hollywood, but whose philanthropic legacy is rooted in discipline. And alongside him, Clooney, a barrister whose entire professional life revolves around precision, accountability, and the consequences of misrepresentation. Think about that combination for a moment. Fame on one side, law on the other, charm balanced by contracts, visibility balanced by rules. This is not a foundation that operates casually, which is why the alleged issue wasn't ignored. It couldn't be, because when your foundation prosecutes war crimes, defends journalists under threat, and advises international courts, your name isn't just branding. It's evidence of trust, and trust is fragile. One unauthorized implication can unravel years of work. So imagine being inside that foundation when someone flags a line of language. Maybe it's a website reference. Maybe it's a press release. Maybe it's a social impact report. It doesn't scream wrongdoing. It doesn't shout fraud. But it implies something. It implies partnership. An implication is enough. Here's the contradiction people miss. In celebrity philanthropy, association is currency. In legal philanthropy, association is liability. The same tactic that builds audience trust can expose institutions to risk. So when the Clooney Foundation allegedly realized its name was being presented in a way that suggested formal collaboration with the Archewell Foundation, the question wasn't emotional. It was procedural. Do we have a signed agreement? Do we have joint projects? Do we have legal authorization for this framing? If the answer to any of those questions is no, the next step is inevitable. Correction. Quiet at first. And that's important, because foundations like this don't jump straight to legal threats. They send messages. They request changes. They expect compliance. In other words, they give you a chance. Which leads to an uncomfortable question. What if that chance was already given? What if someone, politely but firmly, said, "This language needs to be revised"? What if time passed and nothing changed? This is where the tone shifts. Because when a foundation that lives in the courtroom feels ignored, it doesn't escalate emotionally. It escalates structurally. Lawyers are looped in. Risk assessments are drafted. Reputation protection protocols activate. And from that moment on, everything slows down. Silence descends. But that silence is busy. Emails are exchanged. Screenshots are saved. Timelines are mapped. And suddenly, what looked like a single phrase becomes a pattern of communication. This is where the audience should pause. Ask yourself honestly, if this were truly a misunderstanding, wouldn't clarification be immediate? Wouldn't a statement appear saying, "We regret the wording and have corrected it"? That's what typically happens when nonprofits accidentally imply something they shouldn't. But according to those tracking this situation, that kind of immediate public correction didn't materialize. Instead, both sides went quiet. And silence, in legal disputes, is never neutral. Silence is strategy. Now let's talk about Archewell for a moment. From the outside, Archewell presents as modern, values-forward, emotionally resonant. Its messaging emphasizes compassion, community, and systemic change. Its language often mirrors the vocabulary of established humanitarian organizations. That's not accidental. Language alignment signals legitimacy. But here's the tension. When you borrow the tone of legacy institutions, you also inherit their rules. And legacy institutions don't play fast and loose with implied partnerships. Because donors don't parse language the way lawyers do. A donor sees two names together and assumes shared accountability. If something goes wrong with one, it reflects on the other. That's the danger. And that danger is exactly why foundations like the Clooney Foundation guard their brand so aggressively. Not because they're territorial. Because they're accountable. So when people ask, why would they sue? The better question is, how could they not respond? Imagine if tomorrow, an unrelated organization implied it was aligned with your work without permission. Would you let that stand? Would you risk donor confusion? Would you risk journalists calling you for comment about work you never agreed to? Of course not. Now multiply that risk by global scale. That's the pressure here. And it brings us to the emotional center of this chapter. Because this isn't just a legal dispute. It's a collision of two very different philosophies of philanthropy. One built on narrative, visibility, and public resonance. The other built on documentation, authorization, and legal consequence. Neither side sees the world the same way. And when those worlds collide, friction is inevitable. Especially when one side believes its reputation is being leveraged without consent. Here's another uncomfortable question. Could this have been avoided? Probably. Could it still be resolved quietly? Maybe. But once legal mechanisms are triggered, the room for quiet solutions shrinks fast. Because now, it's not about goodwill. It's about precedent. If the Clooney Foundation allows this to slide, what message does that send to others? That their name is flexible? That implied partnerships are tolerated? That's not a risk serious institutions take. And so, according to those watching closely, the foundation did what it always does. It protected its name. Coldly. Precisely. Legally. Meanwhile, outside observers began to notice something else. The shift in tone. Coverage became cautious. Sources became anonymous. Language became conditional. Because everyone understands the same thing. Once lawyers are involved, nothing is accidental. Every word is weighed. Every silence is intentional. And every move is about what comes next. Which brings us to where this chapter ends. Because the power of a name doesn't just start controversies. It determines how they unfold. And once that power is challenged, the fallout doesn't come all at once. It comes in stages. First, silence. Then scrutiny. Then consequences. And the next stage of this story isn't about language anymore. It's about what happens when silence meets investigation. Because once the media begins asking the same questions lawyers already have, the narrative shifts fast. And according to people close to this story, that shift was already underway. But the moment it became public, everything changed. Why did Archewell grow so fast? That's the question people started asking once the silence hardened and the scrutiny intensified. Because when you rewind the clock, Archewell didn't emerge slowly. It didn't build quietly over decades the way most nonprofits do. It appeared fully formed, globally branded, and immediately confident in its moral authority. And that speed matters. Speed changes expectations. Speed amplifies mistakes. Speed leaves less room for learning curves. So to understand why this controversy landed so hard, you have to understand what Archewell was designed to be from day one. This chapter isn't about lawsuits. It's about architecture. Because before there were lawyers, there was language. Before there were allegations, there was branding. Before there was scrutiny, there was a story carefully told. And that story begins with ambition. Archewell was never meant to be small. From its earliest public appearances, it positioned itself not as a local charity or niche initiative, but as a global impact platform. Its messaging spoke the language of legacy institutions almost immediately. Justice, equity, systemic change, compassion at scale. These are not beginner words in the nonprofit world. They are signals. Signals that say, we belong in the same conversation as the biggest players. And that's where the contradiction begins. Because Archewell was founded by figures with immense visibility but relatively little institutional nonprofit history. That doesn't mean bad intentions, but it does mean a steep learning curve. And steep learning curves are dangerous when credibility is your product. At the center of Archewell's public identity is Meghan Markle, someone who understands optics, storytelling, and audience perception instinctively. Her background is in media, performance, and narrative framing. She knows how to position a message so it resonates emotionally. That skill is powerful, but it can also be risky when transferred into spaces governed by legal precision rather than public sentiment. Because nonprofits don't just tell stories. They certify realities. Every phrase implies structure. Every association implies permission. Every mention implies accountability. And Archewell's rise relied heavily on implication. Its website language, its public-facing reports, its press releases, all of it painted a picture of alignment with major global causes and institutions. Not falsely, necessarily, but suggestively. Here's where you should pause. Ask yourself this. When you read that an organization works alongside, supports, or stands with another, what do you assume? Do you assume shared projects? Do you assume formal collaboration? Do you assume vetting has taken place? Most people do. And that assumption is where trouble starts. Because in nonprofit law, implication without authorization can be as problematic as explicit claims. Now consider Archewell's position. It needed credibility quickly. It needed donor trust. It needed legitimacy. And the fastest way to achieve that is proximity. Proximity to they overclarify. They overdisclaim. They triple-check language. Because they know one mistake can undo everything. Archewell, however, moved like an organization that already believed it belonged at the top table. And belief shapes behavior. When you believe you belong, you speak differently. You write differently. You imply differently. You assume alignment will be understood as natural. That assumption is where risk creeps in. Because established foundations don't assume. They document. They formalize. They sign agreements that specify exactly how names can be used, where logos can appear, and what language is permitted. Without that paperwork, there is no partnership, no matter how aligned the values may be. And this is where the Archewell story intersects with legal reality. As Archewell expanded its messaging, observers noticed something subtle. The tone wasn't tentative. It was declarative. It didn't say, "We admire." It didn't say, "We support from afar." It spoke the language of collaboration. And collaboration is a loaded word, especially when the institution you're implicitly aligning with has decades of legal precedent behind it. Let's talk about donor psychology for a moment. Donors are not investigators. They don't check registries. They don't request memorandums of understanding. They trust cues. A respected name next to another name is a cue. And when donors act on that cue, accountability chains form, whether they're legally valid or not. That's why serious foundations are obsessive about how their names appear. Because if Archewell faced criticism tomorrow and donors believed the Clooney Foundation was connected, guess who would get calls? Guess who would be asked to explain? Guess whose reputation would be indirectly dragged into the conversation? That's not hypothetical. That's standard risk analysis. And that's exactly the kind of analysis legal teams perform when they see their foundation referenced in ways they didn't authorize. Now here's the emotional contradiction. From Archewell's perspective, alignment likely felt genuine. Shared values, shared causes, shared language around justice. From the Clooney Foundation's perspective, alignment without authorization is exposure. Both sides may believe they're acting responsibly, but only one side has decades of legal scars that teach caution. This chapter is where the tone darkens. Because Archewell's rise wasn't just fast, it was confident. And confidence, when untested, can border on carelessness. Not malicious, not fraudulent, but insufficiently precise. And in law, insufficient precision is still a problem. As Archewell grew, its footprint expanded across causes, campaigns, and public narratives. The more it spoke, the more language accumulated. And language leaves a trail that lawyers can follow. A trail that can be compared, archived, and analyzed. And somewhere in that trail, according to people watching this unfold, the line was crossed. Not dramatically, quietly. A phrase that suggested more than existed. A framing that implied permission where there was none. That's all it takes. Here's another uncomfortable question. If Archewell truly believed its language was harmless, why not immediately clarify once concerns were raised? Why not issue a correction? Why not say, "We regret the implication and have updated our materials"? That kind of response often resolves these issues before they escalate. But escalation implies resistance, or disagreement, or confidence that the language was defensible. And that's where narratives collide. Because when one side believes its story is justified and the other believes its name is being misused, resolution becomes harder. Especially when both sides are high-profile. Especially when neither wants to appear weak. This is where the audience should start feeling the tension build. Because Archewell's rise set expectations it may now be struggling to meet. Expectations of rigor. Expectations of compliance. Expectations of institutional discipline. And when expectations outpace structure, scrutiny fills the gap. What started as admiration turns into examination. What once sounded inspirational now sounds ambiguous. What once felt aspirational now feels risky. And the story begins to shift. Because now, people aren't just asking what Archewell believes. They're asking what Archewell can prove. And that's a dangerous pivot. Because belief is flexible. Proof is not. As this chapter closes, remember this. Archewell's rise wasn't accidental. It was designed. Strategically, narratively, and emotionally. But design choices have consequences. And when those choices intersect with institutions that operate on rules rather than resonance, something has to give. The next chapter isn't about growth anymore. It's about the moment growth turns into exposure. Because once questions start circulating, the spotlight stops being flattering. And what it reveals next is far more uncomfortable than ambition. Oh, what exactly crossed the line? That's the question lawyers don't ask emotionally. They ask it surgically, because by the time this reached the level it did, the issue was no longer about tone or intent. It was about interpretation, about how language is received, not how it was meant. And that distinction is everything. This chapter is where the story tightens, where ambiguity becomes risk, where a single phrase, maybe even a single word, stops being inspirational and starts being actionable. Because in the legal world, misleading doesn't mean malicious. It means confusing. It means capable of being misunderstood by a reasonable person. And that's a much lower threshold than most people realize. Let's slow this down. When people hear misleading partnership claims, they often imagine something dramatic. A bold statement, a false announcement, a press release screaming collaboration that never existed. But that's rarely how these cases actually begin. They begin quietly, with phrasing, with proximity, with implication. Imagine reading a sentence that places two organizations side by side in the same paragraph. No explicit claim, no contract cited, just alignment language, shared goals, mutual concern, joint impact. Now imagine being a donor. Would you stop to ask whether there's a signed memorandum of understanding behind that sentence? Of course not. You would assume legitimacy. That assumption is the problem. Because in nonprofit law, misleading doesn't require lies. It requires likelihood. Likelihood that someone could reasonably believe something that isn't true. And when that belief affects donations, credibility, or reputation, the issue becomes serious very fast. This is why foundations like the Clooney Foundation for Justice are exceptionally strict about how their name appears in public materials. They don't allow casual mentions. They don't allow implied endorsements. They don't allow creative phrasing. Everything is vetted. Why? Because their work depends on neutrality, authority, and trust. Governments cooperate with them. Courts listen to them. Journalists treat them as a credible source. One unauthorized association can muddy all of that. So when language appears that even hints at a formal relationship that doesn't exist, alarms go off. Not metaphorical alarms. Legal ones. Now, here's where things get uncomfortable. Because according to people familiar with nonprofit compliance standards, most disputes of this nature are resolved quickly. A foundation reaches out, clarifies the issue, requests changes, and usually, the other party complies immediately. Language is updated. References are removed or clarified. Everyone moves on. That's the standard playbook, which raises a critical question. Why didn't this end there? Because the fact that we're even talking about potential legal action suggests something stalled. Either the clarification didn't happen, or it happened too slowly, or there was disagreement about whether the language was misleading at all. And disagreement is where lawyers enter the room. Now let's talk about Archewell's position. From their perspective, it's possible they believed their language was fair, that it reflected shared values rather than formal collaboration, that no reasonable person would interpret it as a legal partnership. That's a defensible position until it isn't. Because once a foundation explicitly says, "We believe this language misrepresents our relationship," the debate changes. At that point, it's no longer about intention. It's about compliance. And compliance isn't negotiated through feelings. It's negotiated through edits. If those edits don't happen, the risk escalates. Now imagine being inside Archewell during this period. You're a relatively young foundation operating under intense public scrutiny. Every move is dissected. Every change is interpreted. Do you immediately revise language and risk admitting error? Or do you stand your ground and risk escalation? That's a brutal choice. Because admitting error feeds critics, but resisting correction feeds lawyers. And neither outcome is clean. This is where emotional beats hit. Because on one side, you have a foundation built on moral messaging and public storytelling. On the other, a foundation built on legal authority and institutional discipline. They speak different languages. And when those languages clash, misunderstanding becomes conflict. Let's talk about what misleading partnership claims can look like in practice. They don't have to say "we partner with." They can say "working alongside." They can say "in collaboration with." They can say "supporting shared initiatives." Each of those phrases carries weight. Each implies coordination. Each suggests permission. And unless there's documentation to back it up, each can be challenged. Now think about how many times you've seen celebrity foundations use that kind of language. All the time. Most of the time, nothing happens. So why here? Because of who is on the other end. Because the Clooney Foundation is not just another nonprofit. It is deeply embedded in legal systems. It understands precedent. It understands how small allowances today become expectations tomorrow. If they allow one organization to imply partnership without consequence, they invite others to do the same. That's how reputational erosion starts. So from their perspective, acting is not aggression. It's defense. And defense, in legal terms, is proactive. This is the moment where public narratives often diverge from legal realities. The public asks, why so harsh? The legal side asks, why take the risk? Both questions are valid, but only one governs outcomes. Now let's talk about the role of silence again. Because silence is not just absence, it's containment. When legal teams get involved, they often instruct everyone to stop talking. No interviews, no statements, no clarifications beyond what is strictly necessary. That silence can look suspicious to outsiders, but internally, it's standard procedure, which suggests this issue reached a level where risk management overtook public relations. And that's significant, because once that shift happens, resolution becomes slower and more rigid. Now here's a twist. Misleading claims don't always come from official statements. They can come from archived web pages, from social impact reports, from third-party articles that were never corrected. If a foundation's name appears somewhere it shouldn't, and it stays there, responsibility doesn't vanish just because time passes. In fact, time can make it worse. Because the longer misleading language exists, the more people see it, the more assumptions form, the more potential harm accumulates. And that accumulation is what lawyers care about. So when people ask, why now? The answer may be, because now was when the risk crossed a threshold. Now was when someone decided it couldn't be ignored anymore. And that decision changes everything. Because once you frame something as misleading, you frame it as corrective. And corrective actions, especially legal ones, are not optional. They demand response. They demand resolution. And they demand accountability. Which brings us back to Meghan Markle, a public figure whose brand has long been built around authenticity, empowerment, and truth-telling. This controversy, if it unfolds further, threatens that brand in a very specific way, not by accusing wrongdoing, but by questioning precision. And precision is harder to defend emotionally, because it doesn't lend itself to speeches. It lends itself to documents. And documents don't care who you are. They only care what you wrote. This is why this chapter matters. Because it reframes the story. It's no longer about whether Archewell does good work. It's about whether its representations were exact. And in law, exactness is everything. As this chapter comes to a close, the tension is no longer abstract. It's procedural. What language was used? When was it used? Who approved it? And what happened after concerns were raised? Those questions don't disappear. They multiply. And once they enter the public conversation, they change how everything before them is viewed. Because now, people aren't just listening to the story. They're looking for receipts. And according to those tracking this closely, the moment receipts became relevant was the moment this story stopped being manageable. The next chapter isn't about language anymore. It's about what happens when silence meets scrutiny. Because once journalists start asking the same questions lawyers already have, the timeline accelerates. And when that happens, the story takes on a life of its own. But the media wasn't always watching. At first, it was just whispers. And those whispers were about to get very loud. Why did the media hesitate? That's the question that confuses people looking back at the early days of this controversy. Because if you scan headlines now, it feels inevitable. It feels obvious. It feels like one of those stories that should have exploded instantly. But it didn't. At first, it barely moved. And that delay tells you everything you need to know about how serious this actually was. Because when stories stall, it's rarely because they lack drama. It's because people are afraid of getting it wrong. This chapter is about silence. Not the empty kind, the calculated kind. The kind that appears when everyone involved knows something is happening, but no one wants to be the first to say it out loud. Because once it's said, there's no undoing it. At the center of this quiet moment was an unusual alignment. Two high-profile entities. One emerging charity with global visibility. One established legal foundation with decades of credibility. And between them, a dispute that didn't lend itself to sound bites. No leaked audio. No viral confrontation. No emotional press conference. Just lawyers, documents, and very careful restraint. That's why early coverage didn't look like coverage at all. It looked like hesitation. Journalists heard whispers. Editors asked questions. Producers flagged potential segments. And then nothing. Because the moment reporters realized lawyers were circling, everything slowed down. Here's why. Media outlets love controversy, but they fear litigation, especially when the dispute involves allegations of misrepresentation. Those words trigger internal legal reviews instantly. If you're a journalist and you hear that a foundation like the Clooney Foundation for Justice is unhappy with how its name is being used, you don't rush to publish. You verify. You double-check. You consult legal counsel. And most importantly, you wait to see who speaks first. Because the first public statement sets the frame. But no one spoke. On the Archewell side, there was no immediate clarification. No public update explaining language choices. No reassurance to donors or supporters. On the Clooney Foundation side, there was no dramatic accusation. No media blitz. No visible escalation. Just silence. And that silence was deafening to the people who know how these things work. Because silence in a legal context doesn't mean uncertainty. It means containment. Behind the scenes, this is when crisis protocols activate. Internal communications are locked down. Statements are drafted and discarded. Every word becomes a potential exhibit. And that's when something subtle but critical happened. The narrative froze. Without a public statement, reporters couldn't safely speculate. Without speculation, the story couldn't gain traction. Without traction, public pressure remained low, which suited both sides, at least temporarily. For Archewell, silence avoided feeding critics. For the Clooney Foundation, silence preserved authority. Neither side benefited from spectacle. But silence has a cost. Because while the public wasn't paying attention, scrutiny didn't stop. It just moved inward. Journalists began calling sources quietly. Nonprofit analysts started reviewing language. Observers compared archived versions of websites and reports. And in those quiet moments, patterns started to emerge. Not explosive patterns. Inconsistent ones. Small shifts in phrasing. Subtle changes in tone. Language that appeared, disappeared, and reappeared. Those changes didn't prove wrongdoing, but they suggested awareness. And awareness is important. Because if language changes after concerns are raised, it raises a question. Why now? Was it coincidence? Routine updating? Or response to pressure? This is where silence becomes suspicious. Not because it hides guilt, but because it hides process. And process is what journalists chase. At the same time, donor communities began asking questions. Quiet ones. Emails. Private messages. Internal discussions among philanthropic circles. People who donate at scale don't react emotionally. They react cautiously. They ask, does this affect credibility? They ask, is this structural or superficial? They ask, should we pause? Those questions don't trend on social media, but they matter far more. Because when donors hesitate, foundations feel it immediately. This is where Archewell's silence became risky. Because silence reassures critics more than supporters. Supporters want clarity. Critics thrive on ambiguity. And ambiguity invites interpretation. Now let's talk about Meghan Markle for a moment. Not as a symbol, but as a strategist. Her public career has been defined by narrative control. By choosing when to speak and when to withhold. By reframing criticism through context and personal storytelling. That strategy has worked before. But this situation was different. Because it wasn't a public opinion battle. It was a compliance issue. And compliance doesn't respond to charisma. It responds to corrections. This is the contradiction that made silence so dangerous. In a media-driven controversy, silence can be powerful. In a legal-adjacent controversy, silence can be interpreted as resistance. And resistance escalates matters. From the outside, people began to notice that Archewell's usual communications rhythm had slowed. Fewer updates. Less public-facing explanation. Carefully worded statements that said very little. To some, this looked like professionalism. To others, it looked like evasion. And that split perception is exactly what turns quiet issues into reputational ones. Meanwhile, legal observers began speculating about what stage the dispute had reached. Was it still in the clarification phase? Had cease and desist language been used? Were lawyers simply advising caution, or had formal demands been issued? Those details matter. Because One narrative framed Archewell as careless. Another framed the Clooney Foundation as overly strict. Another framed the entire situation as a clash of cultures. All of them coexisted, and none of them were corrected. That's the cost of silence. Now consider this. If Archewell had immediately clarified language, even quietly, this story might have died before it started. If the Clooney Foundation had issued a gentle public clarification, the matter might have seemed resolved. But neither happened, which suggests the situation was not simple. And complexity is the enemy of public relations. Because complex stories don't fit into statements. They require explanations. And explanations invite follow-up questions. So silence prevailed. Until it couldn't. Because eventually, someone breaks the quiet. Sometimes it's a journalist. Sometimes it's a donor. Sometimes it's a legal filing. But when that moment arrives, the narrative snaps into place quickly. And according to people watching this unfold, that moment was approaching. The silence had done its job. It contained the issue long enough for positions to harden. Now, the next move wouldn't be about calming waters. It would be about defining reality. And once reality is defined publicly, there's no going back. Because the next chapter isn't about what was said. It's about who started asking questions out loud. And when that happens, silence stops being protection. It becomes evidence. What happens when lawyers take over? That's the moment every nonprofit fears, because once a situation crosses from messaging into legal territory, the rules change instantly. Tone stops matching. Intent becomes secondary, and goodwill no longer carries weight. This chapter is where the story stops feeling like a reputational squabble and starts feeling like a process, slow, methodical, and unforgiving. Because charity law is not built for drama. It's built for accountability. And accountability is cold. Let's start with a truth most people don't understand. Charities almost never sue. Not because they can't, but because the cost isn't just financial, it's reputational. Litigation exposes internal documents. It invites scrutiny. It freezes donor confidence. So when a foundation even considers legal action, something serious has already gone wrong. That's why this part of the story matters so much. Because by the time legal counsel is formally engaged, the dispute is no longer hypothetical. It's documented. Inside foundations like the Clooney Foundation for Justice, legal escalation follows a predictable path. First comes internal review. Every instance of the foundation's name being used is collected. Screenshots, archived web pages, reports, press materials. Nothing is assumed. Everything is verified. Then comes risk assessment. Does this language create donor confusion? Could it imply endorsement? Could it expose the foundation to liability? Could it undermine neutrality in ongoing legal work? If the answer to any of those is yes, the situation moves forward. And that's when lawyers step in, not to argue publicly, but to formalize boundaries. This is the stage where most disputes quietly end. A letter is sent. Language is corrected. Everyone agrees to move on. But here's the key point. If we are still talking about this, it suggests that didn't happen cleanly. Which brings us to Archewell's legal reality. As a relatively young foundation, Archewell operates under a microscope. Every move is analyzed not just by supporters and critics, but by regulators, journalists, and peer institutions. And in that environment, even minor compliance issues can snowball. Because when lawyers examine language, they don't ask, "Did you mean to mislead?" They ask, "Could someone reasonably be misled?" That's a brutal standard. It doesn't care about values. It doesn't care about intentions. It doesn't care about alignment. It cares about outcomes. Now think about how that plays out internally. Once lawyers are involved, Archewell's team would have been advised to stop making changes casually, to preserve records, to document decision-making. Suddenly, what once felt like a branding tweak becomes potential evidence. And that's terrifying for any organization. Because now, every edit raises questions. Why was it changed? Who approved it? When was the concern raised? This is where pressure builds. Not public pressure, internal pressure. Boards get involved. Advisors are consulted. Risk tolerance is reassessed. And this is where emotional narratives collapse under procedural weight. Because no matter how compelling the story, law demands clarity. Now let's talk about the difference between charity law and corporate law. In corporate disputes, companies often fight aggressively. They posture. They negotiate loudly. Charities don't do that. They de-escalate publicly while escalating privately. Why? Because their legitimacy depends on appearing principled, not combative. So if the Clooney Foundation moved toward legal remedies, it likely did so quietly, deliberately, and with an eye toward precedent. Precedent matters here. If a respected foundation allows its name to be used without explicit authorization, it weakens its ability to enforce boundaries in the future. Other organizations notice. They push further. And suddenly, the foundation loses control of its own identity. That's not theoretical. It's a documented risk in nonprofit governance, which explains why this dispute couldn't just be waved away. Now consider the emotional contrast. On one side, a foundation built on storytelling, visibility, and public engagement. On the other, a foundation built on legal precision and institutional caution. They operate on different timelines. One moves fast. The other moves carefully. One values resonance. The other values restraint. When those approaches collide, friction is inevitable. And once lawyers are in the room, the faster-moving side is forced to slow down. That's what people started noticing. Archewell's communications cadence changed. Public messaging became more generic. Specific references were avoided. To casual observers, this looked like professionalism. To legal observers, it looked like containment. Now here's a detail that often gets missed. Legal escalation doesn't always mean a lawsuit is filed immediately. Often, it means a foundation is preparing for the possibility, which involves building a record. Every instance of disputed language is cataloged. Every response, or lack of response, is noted. This record serves two purposes. First, it strengthens the foundation's position if litigation becomes necessary. Second, it creates leverage for settlement. Because once one side knows the other has documented everything, negotiation dynamics shift. Silence becomes risky. Delay becomes costly. And that's when pressure quietly increases. Now ask yourself this. If Archewell believed it had done nothing wrong, what would be the smartest move? Publicly clarify? Privately negotiate? Or wait and see? Each option carries risk. Public clarification can be seen as admission. Private negotiation can leak. Waiting can escalate. There's no clean path. And that's why these disputes are so dangerous. They trap organizations in a narrowing corridor of choices. Meanwhile, external scrutiny grows. Legal experts begin weighing in anonymously. Nonprofit governance commentators start connecting dots. Journalists prepare background pieces. The story doesn't need confirmation to gain shape. It just needs enough signals. And legal involvement is the strongest signal there is. Because lawyers don't move unless something is at stake. Now let's address the role of Meghan Markle in this phase, not as a public figure, but as someone tied to decision-making. In moments like this, leadership matters. Decisions about whether to revise language, issue statements, or contest interpretations flow upward, and those decisions shape outcomes. This is where brand identity meets governance. Because when a foundation is closely associated with a single figure, disputes about language become personal whether anyone wants them to or not. Critics frame it as arrogance. Supporters frame it as unfair targeting. Neither framing helps resolve a legal issue. Law doesn't care who you are. It cares what your documents say. That's the harsh reality of this stage. And it's why this chapter marks a turning point. Because once legal frameworks are engaged, the story stops being speculative. It becomes procedural. Timelines matter. Responses matter. Edits matter. And those details don't disappear just because public attention wanes. They accumulate. As this chapter closes, understand this. Legal escalation doesn't guarantee a courtroom showdown, but it guarantees that someone believes the line has already been crossed. And once that belief exists, the burden shifts. Now the question isn't whether the language was inspiring. It's whether it was defensible. And that's a much harder standard to meet. The next chapter isn't about law anymore. It's about fallout. Because once legal pressure begins, it doesn't stay contained. It ripples outward into donor confidence, media narratives, and public perception. And that ripple was already forming. When donors start hesitating, foundations feel it before headlines do. That's the part most people never see. Because donor confidence doesn't collapse loudly. It tightens. It pauses. It asks questions in private. And by the time the public notices, the damage has already started. This chapter is about that moment. The moment when a legal issue stops being contained inside conference rooms and starts rippling outward into trust, perception, and money. Because once legal pressure exists, donors don't wait for verdicts. They wait for clarity. And when clarity doesn't come, hesitation takes its place. Let's be honest about something. Most people who donate to charities don't read court filings. They don't track nonprofit governance disputes. They don't care about the difference between alignment and partnership. What they care about is confidence. They want to know that the organization they support is stable, transparent, and not embroiled in controversy that could compromise its mission. And when they sense uncertainty, they pause. That pause is everything. At first, it's subtle. A delayed pledge, a request for more information, a donor choosing to wait until things settle. None of that makes headlines. But internally, it sets off alarms. Because foundations operate on predictability. Budgets are planned months, sometimes years in advance. Programs depend on steady inflow. Staff decisions are based on projected funding. When donor behavior shifts, even slightly, it disrupts the entire ecosystem. Now imagine this happening while legal teams are already advising caution. Suddenly, leadership is facing pressure from multiple directions. Legal counsel says, say less. Donors say, explain more. Critics say, we told you so. And the media? The media is watching all of it. This is where the story widens. Because once donors start asking questions, journalists start asking different ones. Not is this true, but what are the implications? Coverage shifts from gossip to analysis, from personalities to systems, from emotion to accountability. And that's a dangerous transition for any organization built on narrative appeal. Let's talk about how media outlets approach stories like this. When a celebrity is involved, coverage often starts sensational and burns out quickly. But when institutions and legal issues enter the picture, coverage slows down and deepens. Editors assign legal correspondence. Fact-checkers review language. Producers ask, is this bigger than it looks? And the answer, increasingly, appeared to be yes. Because this wasn't just about Archewell. It was about how celebrity-founded charities operate in a world that's losing patience with ambiguity. Journalists began contextualizing the situation. They referenced past cases where foundations faced scrutiny over language, partnerships, and donor representation. They asked whether celebrity influence creates blind spots in governance. They questioned whether speed and scale come at the cost of compliance. None of these questions accused wrongdoing. But together, they formed a narrative of risk. And risk is poison for donor confidence. Now let's talk about perception. From the outside, Archewell had always presented itself as polished, intentional, and values-driven. So when questions emerged about misleading implications, even unintentional ones, the contrast was stark. Supporters felt confused. Critics felt validated. Neutral observers felt cautious. And caution spreads. This is where emotional beats hit hardest. Because many donors don't give to foundations like Archewell simply because of outcomes. They give because they believe in the story. They believe in who is behind it. They believe in the promise of doing good differently. When that story becomes complicated, donors don't rush to condemn. They retreat. And retreat is dangerous. Now consider the role of silence again. From a legal standpoint, silence makes sense. From a donor standpoint, silence feels like avoidance. This is the paradox. What protects you legally can harm you reputationally. And what reassures donors can expose you legally. There is no perfect balance. This is where leadership decisions become critical. Do you issue a general statement reaffirming values without addressing specifics? Do you risk saying too much? Do you risk saying nothing? Each choice alienates someone. And that's what makes this phase so destabilizing. Meanwhile, media narratives began to diverge. Some framed the situation as a minor compliance dispute blown out of proportion. Others framed it as a symptom of deeper issues in celebrity philanthropy. Others focused on the power imbalance between a young foundation and a legacy institution. All of them shared one thing in common. They kept the story alive. Because once a story moves from rumor to analysis, it gains longevity. It becomes something people revisit. Something they reference when evaluating future actions. Something that lingers. And that lingering effect is what donors hate most. Uncertainty is worse than bad news. Because bad news can be addressed. Uncertainty just hangs there. Now let's talk about Meghan Markle again, not as a headline, but as a symbol. Her name brings attention. Always has. That attention has fueled Archewell's visibility and reach. But attention cuts both ways. Because when scrutiny increases, it attaches to the person as much as the institution. Media coverage subtly shifted tone. Instead of focusing on Archewell's initiatives, stories began framing the foundation through the lens of its founder's public journey. Past controversies were referenced. Patterns were suggested. Not proven, but suggested. And suggestion is powerful. Because once journalists start drawing lines between separate events, audiences start connecting dots, even if those dots don't belong together. This is where reputational risk compounds. A single issue becomes part of a broader narrative, and broader narratives are harder to control. Now think about how this feels internally. Staff members worry about job security. Partners worry about association. Advisors worry about long-term impact. And leadership worries about everything at once. This is where pressure builds quietly but relentlessly. Because foundations don't collapse from scandals. They weaken from sustained uncertainty, from hesitation, from paused decisions, from deferred commitments. And all of that was beginning to happen. Not publicly, but perceptibly. Now let's talk about the Clooney Foundation's role in this phase. By maintaining silence, they avoided inflaming the situation. But their reputation alone lent gravity to the dispute. Journalists understood that if a foundation of that stature was involved, the issue wasn't trivial. Legal commentators noted that such institutions don't risk confrontation lightly, which only reinforced donor caution. Because donors read between lines. They see silence from a serious foundation and assume seriousness. They see silence from a young foundation and wonder why reassurance isn't coming. Again, perception matters more than facts in this phase. And perceptions were shifting. This is where the fallout truly began. Not with lawsuits, not with statements, but with questions. Quiet ones, unanswered ones. Questions that sat in inboxes and boardrooms and editorial meetings. Questions like, is this resolved? Is it ongoing? Is it structural? Should we wait? And waiting became the default response. As this chapter comes to a close, understand this. The fallout phase doesn't announce itself. It creeps. It reshapes behavior. It changes how people talk about you when you're not in the room. And once that happens, recovery becomes harder. Because now, even if the legal issue is resolved, the perception lingers. The next chapter isn't about donors anymore. It's about lines. Legal lines. Ethical lines. And the moment when one foundation decides those lines must be drawn publicly. Because once that decision is made, there is no more ambiguity. And ambiguity is the only thing that kept this contained. But that containment was about to break. So where does image end and accountability begin? That's the uncomfortable question that started surfacing once the fallout moved beyond donors and into something far more personal. Because this chapter isn't really about a foundation anymore. It's about perception. And more specifically, it's about how public image becomes a liability when scrutiny shifts from intention to pattern. This is the point in the story where everything tightens around one figure, whether that's fair or not. Because Archewell may be an institution, but its identity is inseparable from Meghan Markle. And when institutions stumble, the public looks for a face. That face becomes the symbol. That symbol becomes the story. Here's where the tension spikes. For years, Meghan Markle has been framed in extremes. To supporters, she's a disruptor, a modernizer, a woman challenging outdated systems. To critics, she's calculating, image-obsessed, and overly focused on optics. Both narratives have existed side by side. But this controversy introduces a third framing. Not villain, not victim, but careless. And careless is far more dangerous. Because carelessness doesn't invite sympathy or outrage. It invites doubt. And doubt erodes trust faster than anger ever could. This is where media tone subtly but unmistakably shifted. Not through accusations. Through questions. Questions like, why does this keep happening? Why do controversies around language and representation keep surfacing? Why do issues around precision, attribution, and credit seem to follow this foundation? Notice something important. These questions don't require proof. They rely on accumulation. And accumulation is how reputations change. Because once people start asking whether something is a pattern, every future action is viewed through that lens. Let's talk about contradiction. Meghan Markle's public messaging has long emphasized authenticity, transparency, and truth-telling. She has spoken repeatedly about owning one's narrative, correcting misinformation, and standing in one's truth. That messaging resonates deeply with her supporters. But it also raises the stakes. Because when your brand is built on clarity, even small ambiguities feel magnified. So when language around partnerships is questioned,